here in my voice. I will do my best. I was able to fight through the last class without losing voice. Um, but I'll definitely give you my best. If at some point or another you hear me kind of pause for a second, it's either that I'm coughing madly or I've kind of like got that like, sickness like brain fade for about 5 seconds. So be patient with me. I'll give you my best today. We have we really have two different kind of things that we need to accomplish today. One is to finish up the presentation, work our way out of World War II and talk about the Holocaust to set it up. And then that takes us to our second thing to do today, which is to um, try to, or to not try to, we're going to do it, right? To take a look at the prompt related to the QEP exact assignment, right? Now is that moment where I share it with you because I didn't want to do that before. And I think you guys will see when you look at it, it'd be like, oh, there's not a lot to this. It's actually really kind of a neat exercise to do. So, so let's do that. We'll head on into that really quickly. Oh, I should also mention to you, you probably have already seen it. I went ahead and put up on the announcement page on D2L, kind of like a micro schedule of the next week that relates to the QEP exact assignment, just to make sure you know that you're checking in okay, right? Like, okay, I got what I needed to get done for this class. This is the next step. Just because the syllabus doesn't do that, and I wanted to make sure that everybody felt comfortable knowing that they're getting done what they're assigned to, get done, right? So anyhow, let me then go ahead and dive on into the presentation. And then if we have questions later about the um the QEP assignment, we can ask those when we cover the prompt. So there we go. That's what I'm looking for. All right. And we're all here. Okay. Weirdly, hold on. I'm going to have to hop back out and do this again. It's not indicating to me that it's actually sharing, so I don't know if it was or not. So let's try again. I mean, I guess it's sharing. I don't know. I guess I could ask you guys, is it showing? Oh, there we go. Now it's indicating it. Okay. All right, cool. Thank you, Keenan. I appreciate that. Oh, but it but it did it put it on the wrong slide. Okay. Anyhow. All right, so good enough. When we were last together, we were talking about like heading into World War II. We had just gotten done talking about the question of why it is that Adolf Hitler and the Nazis gained support. I think again that's one of those kind of hindsight questions where like we know what happened, we know what kinds of horrific things came about as a result of their expansionist tactics and the Holocaust. So why did people support them? And we took a look at those questions. Um, what we're going to talk about here in a second does butt up against that same question about support. Um, but at the same time, it also, starts to talk about kind of what things led into World War II. So I'm just going to break into this list and then, we'll kind of, just make sense of these different things. So in 1936, one of the steps that Adolf Hitler took was to remilitarize the Rhineland. The Rhineland is that area where France and Germany come together, that borderland. And the Treaty of Versailles had told Germany they could not have troops there because that was really the borderland that they came through, that Germany came through in invading, France in the first place, right? So they said, no, you can't do this. You can't have troops there. This was just part of a larger effort on the part of the Allied forces to try to keep Germany from having enough power to create a Second World War. The Treaty of Versailles told them not just that they couldn't have troops along the border, but it told them they could only have a defensive army and a defensive navy, and that they couldn't have any air force at all. But as I told you, Adolf Hitler, one of the ways that he gained support was he openly resisted, not even resisted, thwarted the Treaty of Versailles. He just ignored it. At one point, I told you he stood on the steps of the Reichstag and tore up a copy of it just to prove a point that he was not going to listen to it. He brazenly remilitarized the Rhineland. He went on the radio and announced that he was going to do it. So the world, anybody who could speak German, right, knew that he was doing this. This couples with the next one, which was in between 1936 and 1939, Spain underwent a civil war where one of the lead generals of the Spanish army, a man named Francisco Franco, overthrew the Spanish Republic and took over power, which he would stay in power until the 1970s. And he, he was a fascist dictator, right? But he didn't. He went looking for allies outside of Spain that might help him, and perhaps not surprisingly, he reached to other fascists. He reached out to Adolf Hitler, and Hitler said, "Yeah, I'll help you, but I want to use it as an opportunity to test my Air Force." To which you might go, wait a minute, Dr. Gaston, you just said they weren't allowed to have an Air Force. Right, exactly. So he was building this Air Force, but then he did something even worse than build an Air Force. He tested it on civilian targets. And that's actually what this painting is here that you see. Some of you may immediately recognize it, or you'll at least recognize the cubism that's used here. This is a Pablo Picasso painting. It's called Guernica. All right. It's Guernica, Guernica. And this painting is first of all, it's massive, right? It's an amazing feat that Picasso pulled off. It's probably 20, little over 20 feet wide, about 9 feet tall. It's an amazing painting. And it was the reason why Picasso did it was he read a newspaper report about the attack on Guernica. He knew that it was not a military site. It was not a strategic location. It was a civilian town, small one at that. And so he decided he would paint a painting for the Columbian exhibition, which was being held in France, protesting the the this bombing of this small little town. And if you look at this, you can kind of see his references to certain things. There's an arm on the ground holding a broken sword. This is a reference to kind of the lack of military technology in the town. The horse is the same thing, that horses were still being used in places that didn't have, to conduct any kind of military, in places where there wasn't real military might. And then his other statement, obviously, here is that there's a mother off to the left-hand side holding the body of her child. And it's obviously a reference to the loss of innocence, but he's also, of course, showing her kneeling in that position, holding the child, because that's the same position that is so often represented when Mary holding Jesus recently deposed from the cross is depicted. So he's really, kind of invoking this sense of tragic loss and loss of innocence in a way that people can kind of connect to. And this was done in protest. And the world knew what was going on, but nobody really stepped up, just like they didn't when Hitler said on the radio he was going to remilitarize the Rhineland. In 1938, Hitler decided he wanted to annex Austria. So he did. And this annexation is referred to as the Anschluss. Nobody stopped it. For those of you, I mean, there were those who didn't like the idea, and I'm sure there was some nominal resistance. But for those of you that have seen The Sound of Music, or know the story of The Sound of Music, that story is the story of the Anschluss. When Captain von Trapp leaves with his family, it's because Germany has taken over in Austria through annexation, right? That same year, Hitler would call the leaders of Europe to the city of Munich in Germany and hold a conference there, at which he asked for the leaders of Europe to willingly give him that northern region of what we talked about before, of Czechoslovakia, what is now the Czech Republic, a place that he said was culturally German because there were so many German speakers there, a region known as the Sudetenland, and they did. They gave it to him. Why, you might ask? Well, we point to appeasement here. All right. Appeasement meaning an effort to keep Adolf Hitler happy so that Germany wouldn't start a second world war trying to go and take by force that land, right? And that attitude shows up in the statement that I've put here from Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. Chamberlain, on his way, he met with the press corps on his way to go to the Munich conference, and he said, "We should seek by all means in our power to avoid war by analyzing possible causes, by trying to remove them, by discussion in a spirit of collaboration and goodwill." We see the attitude here, trying to avoid war, so therefore we'll collaborate. This doesn't look like collaboration. This feels like capitulation, right? We'll make him happy. We'll give in. We'll give him what he wants, and that'll avoid war. And there are scholars that say that a lot of these European leaders thought that Hitler would mellow, right? He's doing some aggressive things up front. He's trying to get Germany on a solid footing. He's trying to get support for himself, but he'll mellow once he's done these few things. Well, he obviously didn't mellow. And in fact, in the fall of the next year, he invades Poland. All right. Now, this is really the event that starts World War II. All right. This is considered the start of World War II. In October of 1939, he invades Poland using a road system that he's designed before that he claims is intended to help facilitate trade with Poland. Right? It's this multi-lane superhighway that is known as the Autobahn, which is still open to this day. He hasn't created it to facilitate trade. He's created it to make the invasion easier. And this invasion is a quick-hitting, fast-moving invasion known as Blitzkrieg or lightning war. All right, where you send in airstrikes and you bomb the area, knock the place back on its heels, and then send in quick-moving light armored divisions, whether that be on motorcycles or if it be in, kind of these vehicles you see in this top portion, the armored column it mentions, right, where it's kind of fast-moving armored vehicles that can come in fast, right? And honestly, it's so effective and so fast, and Poland also is so weak because it's just come back into existence that it only takes a matter of weeks for Poland to fall to Germany. Now, the problem, of course, and the reason why this causes World War II, the problem, well, first of all, is that that they're invading Poland in the first place. But the other problem is that England has sworn to be the protector of Poland while it gets on its feet. So now England is drawn into the war, and we've been here before. We've seen this. The same exact thing happened in World War I. All right. So what this means is we're going to have the two sides align. The very first is the Axis powers, right? Germany and Italy come together in what is kind of an uneasy agreement to, kind of work together. Mussolini in Italy is not quite as gung-ho about the expansionism and things like that to the degree that Hitler is. But in many ways, the reason why Italy joins is because Italy is going through many of the same kinds of emotional, or the same kinds of, sense of feelings and crisis and so forth. Just like in Germany, where veterans feel kind of dissatisfied by the fact that they not only lost World War I, but things seem to be falling apart. In Italy, the same thing. Italy was on the winning side of World War I, but they got no benefits out of the Treaty of Versailles because they joined so late. And so these veterans, a lot of them felt like, they had given up their health, they had given up, their well-being, they had lost friends, and yet for what? There was no benefit for Italy. Workers, of course, in this bad economy, just like the workers in Germany in the bad economy, were willing to step in behind the strong figure of a fascist because of it. And so these guys had something of an uneasy, kind of relationship. And when I say uneasy, I mean even especially as things like the Holocaust started to be proposed by Hitler, Mussolini kind of looked at it like, no, I don't really see the point in what you're doing. And so he really didn't assist Hitler in, carrying out the Holocaust in Italy. The Empire of Japan is another one of those to mention. that they join in the Axis powers. It's really these three that are the ones worth mentioning: Germany, Italy, Japan. They are the Axis powers. I want to kind of revise something I put here. The Soviet Union, I don't think I should call them part of the Axis powers at first. They actually signed a non-aggression pact with Germany, which stuck until 1941. But they weren't really actively a part of the Axis powers, although you could make an argument that they didn't stand up to the Axis powers either, so maybe they're complicit in those early years. What it is that makes Soviet Union turn against Germany is that Germany invades the Soviet Union in 1941. That'll do it, right? That breaks the non-aggression pact. So the Soviet Union in 1941 will join the Allied powers instead. All right. Now, I do want to talk about these guys for just a second, right? A few different things, right? One of the things I want to talk about is kind of the traits for most of the Axis powers. They are all fascist regimes, but that's not what unifies them necessarily, right? I think you can make an argument that fascists probably can only work with fascists because no democratic society wants to deal with a fascist, right? They don't, it's really kind of against the values of democratic society. So there's no real desire there. So fascists may be the only ones who can work with fascists, but please understand, fascism is not a platform, right? It's not like a unified political movement across the board. Fascism does, one fascist regime might share some traits with others. And so I've put some of those that they actually did share. All of these fascist regimes were nationalist and traditionalist. So all of them emphasized their own, their own culture, right? The conservation and preservation of their culture, which is why we consider them a conservative movement, a far right movement. They were nationalists, believing that they were superior to other nations. They were militant, and they were expansionist. So they used that military, to not only put down resistance within their own countries, but in addition to that, to expand their territories. All right. Now, this is where it gets kind of interesting and weird. A handful of years ago, I don't know, 8 or 9 years ago, I said to a group, I was talking to everybody about this presentation, and I said, you know what? I estimate that if the Axis powers had won, they would have all turned on each other. Because think about this. If they were nationalists, so they all thought they were superior, and they were expansionist, it was going to bring them in conflict with each other, right? I mean, it just makes sense. I was completely blind to the fact that there existed a piece of sci-fi fantasy literature out there that looked at this that very way. Some of you are familiar with it. There's a show. It got turned into a show on Prime Video called Man in the High Castle. And if you've seen this, this is actually based on the book by Philip K. Dick, who kind of entertained this hypothesis. What would have happened if, Germany and Japan and Italy had won? And he makes the argument that he could conceive of Germany taking the eastern third of the United States, Japan taking the western third of the United States, leaving a buffer zone in the middle, right? That was his vision of what would have happened. But the entire time, he has Japan and Germany both trying to pull the rug out from under each other so they can take the other one's territory. And I agree with him. I think that's probably what would have happened. Now, the other thing I want to do before we leave this is this map I think is very useful. This is, of course, a map of the Axis powers in 1942. You could see, of course, the Nazi swastika symbol, right there. In Europe, you could see expansion up into Scandinavia. You can see expansion down into North Africa. We are going to talk about that movement. I've got a better map for showing that movement. But what I really want to draw your attention to is what's going on the east side of this map. I remember I told you 1852, Japan gets a visit from Commodore Perry, adopts the Western technologies. There's this nationalist military movement, and then eventually that springs into empire. Yeah, that's what you're looking at on the east side of the map. That's all the Japanese empire. Okay. So literally it went from saying, oh, wow, it's this, creating an industrial military is about making us, the greatest country that we can be. And then that changed over to we are better than these other countries, and it spread out into an empire. All right, so there you can see what I was talking about before. On the other side of this, the Allied powers, obviously England drawn in, the British Commonwealth with it. If we could dig deep enough into this poster, we would see all sorts of different things. You can see, for example, in there the Australian flag and New Zealand flag. They're part of the British Commonwealth. India actually committed troops too. I think you can make an argument that their help in World War I and World War II probably contributed to them being granted independence after World War II. Um, in addition to that, we have the United States and the Soviet Union. You can see the big three, they're right there. And the Soviet Union, as I said, becomes a part of it in 1941 when Germany invades. So there are two theaters, the Pacific Theater and the European Theater. And yes, as I told you before, I'm not going to cover different battles in great detail. I'm not going to discuss kind of the movements of the. If that is something that interests you, I clearly would tell you go take Dr. Orgill's class on World War II. It is a great class. He's a great historian. I think you'll really enjoy it. For our sake, because we're a 1,000 level class and his is a 4,000 level class, we're going to do kind of a fairly quick flyby on this stuff, but setting up things that we need to set up for future research. So the Pacific Theater obviously fought in the Pacific, in and around the Pacific Islands, including the archipelago that is Japan. Now, that's obviously kind of the last place that sees action in the war is Japan, because the United States is able to hop from island to island and roll back Japanese control of the Pacific Islands in these rather clever ways, and with great tenacity. And the United States then is faced in the end with the question of what do we do with the actual archipelago of islands that make up Japan, right? Like this is the last thing to defeat Japan. Do we invade, or do we go with this brand new weapon we've created, which is the atomic bomb? All right. Now, it wasn't just Japan that was the reason for the United States deciding to create the atomic bomb. In fact, it really wasn't Japan at all. It was really Germany. Germany had been trying to develop an atomic weapon. In fact, we know for a fact that there were Allied forces, especially Norwegian forces, that invaded in Scandinavia to take away from the Nazi regime a heavy water facility that was essentially created to try to help design your weapons grade uranium to make an atomic bomb, right? So, Germany was in the works on it. And then there was another dangerous component, which was Germany was also working on long-range missiles, long-range rockets. The father of their rocket program was a man named Wernher von Braun. Some of you may already know he was actually smuggled out of Germany late in the war by the United States. He was brought here and he became the father of the V2 rocket program for NASA here in the United States instead. And there's a little bit of a contention over, whether that was okay that a, card-carrying member of the Nazi Party then became the father of the rocket program here. But that aside, suffice it to say that that's really one of the major reasons that the United States collected together, countless top shelf scientists from around the world, brought them together in a very interesting program called the Manhattan Project, right? A program that had several different moving pieces that were intended to help create an atomic bomb before Germany could do it. Now, I'm not going to belabor much on the Manhattan Project because you guys are going to read The Trinity, which is a graphic depiction, like a comic book, of that history of the creation and testing and deployment of the atomic bomb. It's actually a really good book, and I'm excited for you guys to read it because it really is it's a phenomenal read, and really interesting to see history depicted that particular way. But the creation of this atomic bomb then became the question, right? Once it became available, it was created during FDR's time in office, but then he passed away, of course, and Truman took over, and Truman, had to make a decision. Do we want to invade Japan or do we want to use this bomb? And Truman had the military draw up a mock-up of what an invasion of Japan would look like and what the estimated loss or estimated casualties would be for the United States. And it came in at about 2 million American soldiers, either killed, missing, or wounded in action. And he decided that the better option for the United States was to use the atomic bomb and try to, bring Japan to surrender. Now, the United States did give Japan heads up, right? They sent a communication to them saying, the strongest bomb in the world right now is the British bunker buster. However, we've developed something that's easily 1,000 times stronger than that bomb. And Japan said, we're going to call your bluff on it, and and said, no, we're not. We don't believe you. On August 4th of 1945, the United States then dropped the first of two atomic bombs. They dropped it on the city of Hiroshima. It was intentionally not Tokyo because Tokyo was such a much more populated city. Hiroshima had small military installments and industrial significance. They chose that city instead. No less tragically, we come to find out that roughly 100,000 people will die either instantly or later as a result of the atomic bomb. Um, you're going to see that Japan decided not to surrender at that point in time. All right. And we are, what you'll see in the book, right? I'll leave those details to you to discover there. So the United States on August 6th dropped a second one on the city of Nagasaki. And Japan then would surrender after that second atomic bomb dropping. And the war ends in August of 1945 in the Pacific Theater. It had already ended in April of 45 inside of Europe. And the European theater, right, you can see how expansive it had to be throughout Europe because Germany had invaded so many places. Germany had gone up into the Baltic states, it had gone up into Scandinavia, it had done air raids into England, bombing the city of London in what's called the Blitz. It had gone into France. It occupied northern France and left southern France to an allied fascist regime out of the city of Vichy, which is in southern France, right? We have them invading into the Balkans, into Poland, which was the very first step, and eventually, as you can see, into the Soviet Union in June of 1941 in what's called Operation Barbarossa. All right, so this was expansive. The only thing that's really left off this map is that toward the end of the war, as the United States started having success coming up through the Italian peninsula, Hitler was very angry with Mussolini and, really felt that Italy was failing him. So he invaded Italy also, right? And that isn't actually on this map because, well, partially because it ends in 42. So it hadn't happened yet. But nonetheless, so the only battle that I talk about here really is the invasion at Normandy, D-Day, right, which saw the United States in its greatest effort, right, essentially land on the beaches of Normandy, which if we look right at the coastline of France here that faces England, right, Normandy is up there, and the United States then essentially tried to throw decoys and land in one of the least fortified areas of the beaches in Normandy, try to dislodge Germans from those positions. And then, that way try to essentially start by liberating France and marching into Germany. They also dropped paratroopers in behind German lines to try to attack from both directions. Initially, the attack was rather successful, but Germany would push a counteroffensive against the Allied forces. And we get what's called the Battle of the Bulge, which literally sees the Allied troops, the lines of the Allied troops kind of bow back in towards central France, only for armored tank units to come down through the Ardennes forest from the north and attack the German forces, which eventually broke the German forces and allowed for the Allied forces to get into Germany and overthrow the Nazi regime. All right. So that war, as we said, ends in April, or that portion of the war ends in April of 1945. So this leaves us with the last things to cover, which is the Holocaust in preparation for our exercise I try to give you as comprehensive of a coverage of the Holocaust as possible. This means covering not just the camps, which I think most people know about, but covering all of the different kinds of camps. But in addition to that, talking about it outside the camps also in all of its various forms. All right. I do like to just kind of give people a little heads up. I don't think anybody is surprised at all to know that this is a heavy topic. We are talking about the systematic execution of at least 6 million members of the Jewish community, as well as easily 3 million other people from outside the Jewish community. And even as we keep adding numbers and analyzing things, we now think that instead of just 8.5 or 9 million, that there may be upwards of 11 million people that were systematically killed by all forms of the Holocaust altogether. And folks, obviously the magnitude of that is huge. It only has one other thing that compares in the history of man and of the Western world, and that is the Atlantic slave trade, which saw over the course of 400 years 13 million people displaced and put into that terrible institution that is the Atlantic slave trade. Um, the one major difference when you're making the comparison numerically is what's really, I think, shocking and mind-blowing when you talk about the Holocaust is that loss of 11 million lives was done in a decade, right? Which is just wild and perverse to think of that kind of systematic technological execution of people, right? I do also like to warn people, I do include some images in here that may be a little unsettling, and certainly are a little unsettling, but that is the nature, obviously, of the topic. So if you do need to step away for a second, by all means, I perfectly understand. Um, so let's start by talking about the camps themselves, right? There are a variety of different camps in a variety of locations. They had different objectives, and they even had different appearances, okay? It really was a network ranging throughout much of Central, Western, and Northeastern Europe. All right. Maybe not even just Northeastern, Eastern, just in general. Europe is an easy way to put it. Um, they ranged everything from transportation camps like Drancy, which was outside of Paris, where people who were, brought in from Western Europe, right, gathered and put on trains to be taken to camps would be transported to Drancy, right, where they would be divided up and sent to other locations. Um, all the way to, I think, the more recognizable names, right? The most notorious of labor and execution camps, and that includes the complex at Auschwitz, Birkenau, and Buna. This was like a complex of different camps that were put together. This was in Poland. So let's take a minute to talk about Auschwitz, Birkenau, because it is obviously the focus of our testimonies that we're going to take a look at. Um, it was a labor camp. It had an industrial complex. That industrial complex included a chemical factory run by a German company called IG Farben. Their Jewish labor was used as forced labor to create a number of chemicals, and most perversely, that included a chemical known as Cyclone B, which was used in the showers, which we'll talk about in a second, to execute Jews. All right. Um, Another thing that a lot of times people tend to know about Auschwitz is that Auschwitz was also the site of laboratory experiments performed by a, I hesitate to call him a doctor, quote unquote. Doctors take the Hippocratic Oath and know better than to do these kinds of things. This guy was trained, had a medical degree, let's put it that way. He had been trained in the medical arts. His name was Josef Mengele. He performed a whole series of experiments, sometimes intended to understand the limits of human body and what kinds of things it can tolerate so that soldiers, pilots, etc., could be, the Nazi regime could know what their soldiers and their pilots could tolerate. So, for example, there was an experiment done where he submerged a human in in freezing temperatures, right? In a vat of water at freezing temperatures to see how long the body could go submerged, so he could, so then they could figure out pilots that were flying across the Arctic, how long they would live in those cold waters, right? And anyhow, so you get the idea. Obviously, using human subjects we know is something that's completely and totally forbidden and unethical. And he did it. But the weirdest and most perverse experiments, perhaps, were the ones that he performed on twins, right? So members of the Jewish community that came in that were part of twin sets were set aside for his use in laboratory, right? And to put it in a very warped way, he would do things like he would inject one with a disease to see if the other would show symptoms, or he'd exact excruciating amounts of pain on one to see if the other would feel it. And some of these twins, by miracle perhaps, survived these experiments, and one of them was a woman named Ava Kor, who went on to go and become a curator of a Holocaust museum in Western Indiana. And she had a headache one day and went to the medicine cabinet to get some aspirin, and saw the sign, the Bayer aspirin sign, the Bayer medical sign on the bottle. And it triggered a memory. She remembered seeing that emblem on boxes in Mengele's laboratory. And so she and other survivors of Auschwitz camp sued Bayer for their role in the Holocaust, and in particular in the Mengele experiments. Bayer was actually acquitted because there had been several owners of Bayer since World War II. But I think Bayer kind of recognized that there was a very distant and indirect connection. And my understanding is that Bayer to this day still does a lot to support Holocaust survivors and Holocaust memorials and foundations related to Holocaust awareness. I think out of a sense that they are distantly connected to these atrocities. So let's take a moment though, and let's kind of walk through Auschwitz for a second. Um, I'm pulling in particular from the writings of Elie Wiesel. Many of you have probably heard of him. He was an Auschwitz survivor. He was a professor. He was a prolific author. He wrote the novel Night, which was a novel based on his experiences in Auschwitz and the experiences of others. So um, it came to reflect the experiences of camp interns or camp inmates in Auschwitz. He talks about being rounded up from the ghetto in his home, his home country of Poland, and being taken then to a cattle car, being stuffed into a cattle car. Nobody could lay down. Everyone had to stand up. There was no place in this cattle car to relieve yourself. There was no food. There was no water, and you were in there for days and days. Some people passed out. Some people died while in the cattle car. He made it to Auschwitz only to go through the iron gates at the front of the camp, where this perverse message had been created on the gates that said, Arbeit macht frei. Work will set you free. Because when you start talking about Auschwitz, one of the things you come to realize is that it was all a perverse psychological manipulation, not just this kind of toying with the inmates that maybe if they worked hard enough, they would be set free. But in addition to that, the systematic dehumanization that took place to make these people feel like they were less than human, to make them, feel like being Jewish was an awful thing, to take away their identity from them. And we're going to see all of that dehumanization here as we talk about it. Wiesel relates that once they arrived inside the camp, they came to a platform. You were ushered out of the cattle car. You had one bag of possessions with you. Those worldly possessions were taken from you, right? You would never see them again. And then you were divided into two different lines. One line was mothers and daughters, and the other line was fathers and sons. This was for many the last moment that mothers saw their sons or that wives saw their husbands, or that daughters and fathers saw their loved ones from the other lines. All right. So, then they were marched off from there, um, past open pits where flames were, where bonfires had been set. And he said the horrible things that he saw: guards beating people, pushing people, hitting them with the butts of their rifles. He even saw SS guards tearing babies away from mothers and throwing them into these pits. He said, if you could conceive of hell before this, you rethought of it, because this was clearly the scene that defined what hell looked like. You were then marched to barracks where there were rooms filled with showers. You were taken inside. You were stripped of your clothing to humiliate you. Your head was shaved to further humiliate you. This was especially effective to humiliate the women. Then you were told you would be sent to the showers to be cleaned, because you were, as Hitler would put it in his book Mein Kampf, Untermenschen, subhuman people. Some of those people that were sent to showers were actually sent to legitimate showers where there was water that came out. But the vast majority of them were sent to rooms filled with showers where the doors were sealed off, and what came out of the shower head was not, in fact, water. It was Cyclone B gas created at the IG Farben chemical factory. Those people would be asphyxiated to death. If you were one of the survivors, you were then issued a uniform, a striped uniform with a number on it. The next morning, you would be woken up, given roll call, and as you stepped forward, you would have the number from your uniform also tattooed on the inside of your left forearm. Systematic stripping people not only of their worldly possessions, but of their name, their identity, telling them that what made them lesser was their ethnicity and their religion, trying to deprive them of that part of their identity too, through a message of, this is lesser than everybody else. This is the reason why you're here. So you can see the psychological torment that was used in these camps. Um, I want to talk to you about what is a weird camp to talk about, and that is Theresienstadt. All right. Theresienstadt was a show camp. Okay. It was in occupied Czechoslovakia. It was one of a handful of show camps. Why did the Nazi regime feel the need to create show camps? Quite simply this. During World War I, refugee camps had been created by both sides of the war, and those camps had oftentimes been very unclean, unsanitary, unhealthy, obviously, then, where prisoners of war or refugees displaced because of the war were not treated with great kindness. And the Red Cross caught word of that, and the Red Cross swore that they would monitor, quote unquote, refugee camps, in future wars. So when World War II broke out and these concentration camps were formed and people were assigned to them, this was seen as, in many ways, in the Red Cross's eyes, refugee camps. And so the Red Cross swore to visit camps to make sure that things were okay. So the Nazis created show camps, camps to make the Red Cross think that things were okay. Theresienstadt had a pool. They had a weekly movie night. They had regular social dinners, things of the like, to make the Red Cross believe that everything was a-okay. All right. One of the other ones was the camp in Germany called Regensburg. That there was a very famous Jewish family. You've probably heard of them. We call them the Rothschild family. Their name is really pronounced Rothschild, but nonetheless, this family was sent to Regensburg because the Nazis knew that if this incredibly wealthy, high-profile family disappeared because of the Holocaust, it would be obvious and they would be, essentially caught doing what they were doing, which implies that the Nazi regime knew that what they were doing was not okay, but they did it anyway. Now, let's talk about the Holocaust outside of camps. And again, my apologies, some of these are very weighty and disturbing videos. Um, when we talk about it outside the camps, we start as early as Hitler's rise to power and coming to office, right? Much of what we've talked about already appeared in Hitler's book, as we said before. Hitler dictated this book. Rudolf Hess, who became one of his ministers in his cabinet, but also was his cellmate, wrote it really for him. Hitler just dictated it to him. His book is called Mein Kampf. It means my struggle. It was dictated in July of 1925 while the two were in prison for trying to overthrow the government in Munich, Germany. Anyhow, the in this book is where he identifies Slavs and Jews as what I said, Untermenschen, less than like subhuman people, lesser people, and says that Germany needs to expand. It needs living space or Lebensraum. And that those people who get in the way, those Slavs and Jews, would have to either become slaves to quote unquote superior races or would have to be eradicated. So he was already calling, out the fact that he was going to expand, and these were the kinds of things he was going to do. But even before that started to happen, in Germany, we consider this part of the Holocaust too. He was carrying out a program of what we call the T4 euthanasia program that essentially didn't target the people who got targeted in camps. It targeted Germans who had disabilities. So this included the elderly and children, quote unquote, under the age of 3, in whom any of the following serious hereditary diseases were suspected: idiocy, which is a terrible term for, for mental disability; Mongolism, which is an awful term for Down syndrome; microcephaly, so too small of a head; hydrocephaly, which is what has been traditionally called water on the brain; malformations, and paralysis. These people who had these conditions were to be registered with the government. That register then was used to round these people up. A truck with blacked out windows would show up at their residence, would take them away. They'd be taken to a secret location, put in a room. They would seal the room, but before they left the room, and left these people in there, they would fire up a diesel submarine engine and asphyxiate them using carbon monoxide. There's great questions here in both of these things, the book and the program. What did people know? What did people suspect? You could say maybe nobody read Hitler's book, but when Hitler came to power, he gave a copy to every married couple that got married while he was in power. It was in circulation. And as for people being removed from society, and in particular, the most vulnerable people in society, the people who needed the assistance of their community, people seemingly had to know, right? How did this keep building becomes the question. How did it keep spreading? How did it draw in so many people? We're going to focus then on a much larger body of people involved in the Holocaust outside the camps, and that's a group known as the Einsatzgruppen. Now, there's not a great translation for this in English, but scholars have oftentimes referred to these guys as Hitler's mobile killing forces. All right. These guys operated in the eastern portion of Europe, places like Poland and Russia and the Ukraine. And these guys included not only troops that would take over in these areas, but in addition to those troops, order police units that would come in, secure the town, and most often round up the Jewish community, make them dig their own mass grave, and then systematically execute them in the fashion you see in the bottom image. One of these places that saw the Einsatzgruppen in action was Babi Yar. And in September of 1941, over the course of 2 days, the Einsatzgruppen executed 34,000 people. To this day, there's a mound where that grave is, covered by earth, and that mound stands as a memorial. In fact, many Ukrainian Jewish families have been given the option of exhuming the body of their loved one and having them repatriated in family cemeteries or community cemeteries. And the families have all said, no, let them be. Let them be a reminder to the world. Let them be a reminder to not let this happen again. There have been some scholars that have focused in on the Einsatzgruppen very carefully. Two of them are Jonah Goldhagen and Christopher Browning. Both of these guys studied a order police battalion that was part of the Einsatzgruppen. In particular, they studied the Order Police Battalion 101. This was a group out of Hanover, made up of common, everyday, ordinary men. All right. And these guys were oftentimes cobblers making shoes, or clothes salesmen, or insurance salesmen, or you name it, right? Just everyday average men. Goldhagen asked the question, why would these guys do this? Because, as both acknowledge, when these guys make their way out into Poland, their commanding officer gets the orders from back in Germany that they are to round up and execute Jews in the town. And the first time this happens, he tells his men, if you don't want to be part of this, step forward. I will dismiss you without punishment. Nobody does. To Jonah Goldhagen, he says this is because these guys were anti-Semitic. They hated these Jews, he says. And they were, to use the title of his book, Hitler's willing executioners. Christopher Browning looks at that argument and says, you know what? I have no doubt that there are people who are anti-Semitic, and maybe this was something that they wanted to do, but I don't think that's probably an explanation for everyone. And he went back and he looked, and in his book, Ordinary Men, he took a deep look at trying to figure out what makes an ordinary man commit genocide. A very valid question for us to ask to this day, because genocide hasn't gone away, right? We need to be able to answer that kind of a question, so maybe we can stop it. Browning looks at a number of things. He says, maybe it's propaganda, right? Maybe they were fed all these ideas about the Jewish community, and he looks at their training and he says, no, it's not there. Then he says, maybe it's what he terms battlefield frenzy. This idea that maybe they have a proclivity toward violence as a result of seeing so much warfare, right? Something that we would, see potentially in very severe forms of PTSD. He says, no, these guys haven't seen battle. So when these guys choose not to step away, the only thing he can come to is, number one, these guys joined the military to assure a future. The economy back in Germany had stagnated, right? It was a wartime, it was a buildup toward wartime. That's what helped the economy when Hitler came to power. But now all the resources are being turned toward the war effort, and the economy back home was really not that strong. There was not much great promise for people. However, these guys recognized that joining the military, well, that had promise, because that's where that's the basket all the eggs are being put in. And so they joined so that they could have promotion, so they could have future for their career. So to say no to orders could mean the end of their career. In addition to that, he says, may have been conformity. Maybe they operated under duress. We know that the Nazi regime threatened violence, carried out much violence. Maybe they did it because of that. But maybe they act in conformity out of a place of not wanting to let down the man next to them. This man with whom they had trained, this man with whom they had made it all the way out to Poland. The thought of abandoning the guy next to you with this terrible task, right, and not joining and sharing the burden. Right? He believes that is one of the biggest factors, that these guys didn't want to abandon their colleagues. Now, again, Browning will say very openly, right, this is not about justifying, legitimating anything like that. It's just about understanding. Right? And again, trying to make sure we've come to understand so that maybe we can stop genocides from happening in the future. But that is his explanation for why ordinary men might have gotten involved. So this is the last real slide that I'm going to show you. And again, it has some sensitive material in here, and I'll do my best to try to work with it as sensitively as possible. But as the war ended and the Holocaust ended, many of the German officer corps, German political administrators, et cetera, either chose to end their own lives In a few cases, they went ahead and stood trial for their actions. Albert Speer being one of them, who was the lead architect, for the Nazi regime, literally building buildings. He had been part of a conspiracy to try to assassinate Hitler, and therefore felt like he could stand trial, and maybe be, kind of given a lighter sentence. He did spend a significant amount of time in Spandau prison as a result of it, of being involved with this administration. However, in addition to that, right, there were those who tried to escape. One of them was a guy named Adolf Eichmann. Eichmann was the guy who essentially designed all the logistics for what's called the final solution. As the war was coming toward an end and things didn't look good for Germany, Hitler decided that it was necessary to ramp up the efforts of the Holocaust and try to get rid of all European Jews as quickly as possible. And he called this the final solution. The guy that designed all the train tables and figured out all the logistics was Adolf Eichmann. So needless to say, Eichmann was considered to be a prominent part of the Holocaust and was going to stand trial, and he knew that. So he tried to escape by going to Argentina. He was found there, and he was extradited in the middle of the night by the Israeli special forces known as the Mossad. All right. Stood trial in Jerusalem. And in the crowd at that trial was a Jewish thinker, philosopher, author by the name of Hannah Arendt, who made a statement. She said in her book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, she felt like Jews in the Holocaust had gone, quote unquote, like sheep to the slaughter. Well, she said that, and immediately scholars came out of the woodwork to say, no, 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 no. There were those people who couldn't believe that this was a reality. Elie Wiesel talks about this. There are those that when they were warned, maybe somebody who escaped to camp and came back home, maybe somebody who had witnessed a mass execution, came back home and said, "You got to get out of here." And as many people would do, the people of these towns said, "No, you're making this up. You're crazy. Nobody would ever do anything like that." But that's where, the resistance begins, right? That's the only instance, these scholars say, where somebody might have not fought back. There's plenty of resistance to be seen otherwise. As Germany went into Lithuania, Jewish resistance fighters armed themselves and ambushed German troops coming through Lithuanian forests. They hid there in underground homes until they had opportunities to attack them. There were camps that were overthrown. Two in particular, Sobibor and Treblinka. If you've not heard of them, it's because the Nazi Party was really worried about letting the world know that this group that they had deemed weaker and inferior had in fact overthrown some of their camps rather cleverly. Sobibor and Treblinka were physical, violent revolts against the guards, and in both cases, the camp inmates freed themselves. There's within the camps, if you're being told your ethnicity and your religion is your reason for being there, that it's wrong, it's lesser, that you're not human, if there are efforts to strip you of your identity and take your life, then prayer and traditions, maintaining those things, well, that's a form of resistance, as is survival a form of resistance. The networking that was made to help people survive, the emotional support, the care, the gathering of some portion of your food and gathering it together with others to give to the weakest person in your barracks because they were getting sick, they were starving to death, saving their life. Well, that's part of resistance. Because after all, the Nazis, in the end, were seeking to take your life. Which takes us to the most contentious of all of them. And again, I will treat this with great sensitivity because I know the sensitivity of this topic. There were, not surprisingly, people in the camp who took their own lives. And there has been debate about that. Was that giving the Nazis what they wanted in the end? Or was that denying the Nazis the labor of that person, the satisfaction of dehumanizing that person? There are some thinkers who argued that there's precedent in the history of Judaism for suicide as a form of resistance. And for that, we have to go all the way back to the Roman Empire. And we have to talk about this plateau you see here off to the right. That's Masada. See, Rome took over during the first century Common Era in Jerusalem. And obviously, there were many people who didn't like this idea, but in particular, there was one resistance group known as the Sicarii. They were a group of assassins. They went and they assassinated Roman office holders, as well as people of their own community who they felt were complicit with the Roman takeover. Their goal was to provoke a war between Jerusalem and Rome that might end in Jerusalem's freedom. But nobody rallied around them. And they knew then that Rome would show up, look for them, and, well, who knows? Perhaps execute them. Perhaps send them back to Rome to fight in gladiatorial games or to be fed to the lions for the public entertainment. Perhaps made into slaves. It wasn't clear. So these guys went up to this plateau where there was a palace, a very old palace. Maybe not super old, but fairly old. Let's put it that way. It had belonged to King Herod. Herod, as you may know from the New Testament, was not a particularly good guy, not beloved by his people. And I think Herod always knew that there may come a day when things went terribly awry and he might have to hide. So he built this palace, almost a panic room of sorts, up on top of this plateau. Well, that's where the Sicarii, these assassins, went. They holed up there and locked themselves in. And the Romans pursued them. And the Romans, it took them a few days to cut a path up the plateau, up to the plateau to get their equipment up because the door was locked. So they needed battering rams and the like to get the door open. When they finally did get the door open, they found that all of the Sicarii were dead. Now, we don't know exactly how it transpired, but all of them had taken their lives in one way or another. And there are those thinkers out there that say, well, this is a precedent. These guys were standing against Rome. They were saying, no, you will not use my body as for slavery. You will not use my body for entertainment to be fed to the lions. And in fact, Masada is rather significant to the Israeli community. It sees millions of tourists of the Jewish faith coming to the plateau a year, and those not of the Jewish faith too coming to the plateau. But in addition to that, when you serve your mandatory time in the military, you take your oath at the plateau at Masada. So it's very significant in that way. So there's great debate about this, how we are to see, because obviously we value human life and we don't want to see people take their lives. But you have the academic arguments made otherwise on both sides of this argument. So to kind of lighten things up, right, World War II ends, and we're going to see the Cold War begin, and that's going to include the division of Germany initially into occupation zones. You can see this chunk to the Soviet Union, Great Britain, United States, France. All right. That is eventually going to consolidate into two chunks of Germany. West Germany, those areas, that area associated with capitalist democracy. East Germany, that area associated with communism and with the Soviet Union. Berlin, which is the capital, sits right in the middle of East Germany, but as a result was actually, because it was the capital, was divided between the two sides. So literally, you get East Berlin and West Berlin divided up into two sections, divided up also by a wall. All right. And we'll talk more about the Cold War down the road. So in the meantime, I'm going to come back to you. I'm going to share instead now the prompt because we have about 5 minutes. That should be just about enough. I'm going to share the QEP assignment prompt. Yeah, I say, and then I didn't do it right. Okay. I'll share that prompt with you and we're going to walk through it. This prompt will be up on D2L here shortly. I always like to read through prompts with my classes before I post them. That way, if you guys have a question about something, I can clarify it and make it appear in the language. Or if you have a question, or if you just flat out are like, hey, could you add this to it? Yeah, I can certainly do that. That's not a problem. But I'll post this here, within the next couple of hours for you guys to have access to. So let's read this together. QEP exact assignment. All right. For this activity, students will analyze oral accounts from Auschwitz camp survivors located in a virtual archive. As a result, the class will gain insight into the professional process of historical writing and will evaluate the impact of oral testimonies on historical narratives, particularly as it relates to understanding the human experience in historical events. All right. Keep scrolling. My pointer is disappearing on me. All right. After the class has completed its lesson on the Holocaust, which we just did, students will be asked to visit the website 70 Stories of Auschwitz. All right, this is the University of Southern California website. All right, where it'll select 10 to 12 oral histories to study. Now, that seems like a lot until I tell you that none of these recorded oral histories are longer than about 2.5, 3 minutes. Okay, so there's not a lot there, right? In fact, many of you will say, I really would have liked to have heard more from this person. I think that the goal was to get these small snippets so people would be interested, and it could keep people's attention, but then you can kind of put together those 10 to 12 histories to kind of come up with a larger analytical picture. After listening to and analyzing these stories, you'll complete the critical thinking assignment that appears below and submit it to the designated Dropbox on D2L. When you listen to these, right, take notes over everything, not just what exactly they're talking about, but things that you think, like, oh, wow, I made this observation, or I wonder this kind of a question, or I notice that when this is talked about, this is the way it's represented, why, and kind of hypothesize and work with these things. But take really good notes, because obviously you're going to use these notes when you do the exercise, right? The discussion, right? And we're talking about, the discussion that will hold once you've turned in your assignment, right? We'll have that discussion on the 6th of November. It will be based on this exercise and related questions. After the completion of the discussion, I will have you submit the exercise again, a second time, but to a different software. It's called SLNL. All right. The reason for that is because the people who do the pilot project, they want to see it also. I need it in D2L to grade it, but they need to see what people are putting out there, what people are saying, is so they can analyze it for the pilot project for the quality enhancement plan for the college, right? So access for SLNL is gained through the activities menu on D2L. We'll cover that later, don't worry. And when we get to that, once you've turned it in on SLNL, you upload it there. You'll complete, there's a reflection assessment there, a reflection assignment. You complete that, and then that will make it so that you will get an overall grade. All right. Here are the questions that are in that critical thinking assignment that you turn in on D2L, and that you, where is my pointer going these days? There it is. Okay. The questions that you'll turn in on D2L and on SLNL, the critical thinking assignment. So it says, please answer all of the following 3 questions using a computer to fill in the answers in between the questions. When you are done, please submit your completed exercise to the D2L assignment Dropbox. All of these are going to ask for evidence. That's great. Be aware of that. Be sure you take notes. And your citation can just be the name of the person speaking. Okay. If you want to put the time there too, that would probably be very useful also. All right, so please answer all of the following 3 questions. When you're done, please submit it. Your completed exercise to the D2L assignment Dropbox. All right. How did the information presented in class overlap with and differ from that presented in the 70 Witnesses Archive? Okay. Use at least 3 specific pieces of evidence to explain your answer. Did your visit to the virtual archive change your overall view of the impact of the Holocaust and its place in World War II on the individuals who lived through it? Why or why not? Give at least 3 good reasons for the change or the non-change of your views. And third, of the interviews you watched, which do you think was the most compelling account of the Holocaust? Why did you pick this interview? Provide at least 3 reasons to justify your answer. So you get to, on that very last one, kind of focus in on just one interview and go deeper into that one, dive deeper into that than maybe you do with some of these other questions. All right. Now, again, I am also going to post for you or I've already posted for you a kind of micro schedule, right? Of today, and I talk about kind of transitioning to Tuesday, which will be kind of we'll do this kind of in-class discussion kind of a thing. Largely it's a check-in session, right? You don't have to have all 10 to 12 testimonies watched, but whatever you have done, right? We can have, I'll ask you a few questions here or there. What kinds of observations are you making? Like what kinds of things have surprised you? Things that are just to kind of be thought-provoking without us actually answering the specific question, right? Any of those three specific questions. And and then of course, it's going to be a week from today that the actual assignment is due. First into D2L before we start class, and then after class on SL and L while you do the reflection assignment too. Okay? Questions on any of that? Good.
Can you re-explain the prompt again? Like I know it's critical thinking, right?
Um yeah, well, I'm not certain I quite get your question there. I mean, there's a lot in the prompt to explain.
Hmm.
So, I mean, I don't know that. I mean, I think it's fairly self-explanatory. I would say go back in and read the prompt. Um, but if you have like a specific question, like what are the critical thinking assignment questions? Well, those are the actual assignment you're carrying out and turning in.
Okay.
Will, what's up?
So my question was, are you gonna post the prompts on your e-class as well? So I'm
Yeah,
just curious.
absolutely. Yeah,
Okay,
I'm in the
cool.
habit of going through prompts with you guys before I post them so that if you guys see a gap in them, I can adjust that gap rather than, it that problem staying there. I'd rather shore it up with you guys and then I post it. So here in the next, I've got to go into a couple of meetings, but here probably in about an hour, hour and a half, I'll have it up and running. Okay.
Gotcha. Appreciate
All
it.
right. Rock and roll. Anybody else? All right, good enough. Well, that is it for today then. I'll look forward to checking in with you guys on Tuesday about this assignment. And I'll look forward to our overall discussion a week from today. All right. Have a great weekend. Stay warm. Good luck with that. we're weak Southerners. We don't do this weather. Anyhow. All right. I will see you all.